Emily was always full of life, a spark that lit up any room she entered. At 16, she balanced school, friendships, and a close bond with her father, John, who had raised her alone since she was a toddler. Their bond was special, built on countless camping trips, movie nights, and shared secrets. Emily was not just John's daughter, she was his world. One rainy afternoon, as Emily returned from school, her usual bright smile was hidden under the safety of an umbrella. The streets were slick with rain, and the visibility was low. As she crossed the street, just a block from her home, a speeding car skidded on the wet asphalt. Despite the driver's desperate attempt to brake, the car struck Emily, launching her several feet across the street before she landed, unconscious and barely breathing. The sound of the impact drew neighbors from their homes, umbrellas forgotten in the rush to help. One of them, Mr. Thompson, recognized Emily immediately and called for an ambulance while shielding her with his coat. He dialed John next, his voice shaking as he tried to calmly explain the situation. John's heart sank the moment he heard Mr. Thompson's voice, filled with urgency and fear. Dropping everything, he ran through the rain, the few blocks to the scene feeling like an eternity. When he saw Emily, motionless on the wet ground, surrounded by concerned faces, his strength almost failed him, but he held it together, squeezing her hand and whispering reassurances that he wasn't sure were true. The ambulance arrived quickly, cutting through the dull noise of the rain with its sharp sirens. As the paramedics worked efficiently to stabilize Emily, John could only watch, feeling helpless and terrified. They rushed her to the hospital, where doctors immediately took her into surgery to address internal injuries and a severe head trauma. The hours ticked by slowly in the hospital waiting room. John sat there, soaked and shivering, surrounded by the sterile hospital sounds that seemed to echo his fear. Friends and family trickled in, offering hugs and soft words of hope, but John could barely respond. His mind was fixated on the operating room doors, praying for good news. Finally, the surgeon emerged, looking weary but calm. Emily was stable, but she was in a coma. The head injury had been severe, and while the surgery went as well as it could, the next hours and days would be critical. They had done all they could. Now, it was a waiting game. John spent every day at the hospital, talking to Emily about her friends, recounting episodes of their favorite TV shows, and reminding her of all the trips they had planned. He held her hand, sometimes reading aloud from her favorite books, hoping she could hear him, hoping she would wake up. The hospital room filled with cards and flowers, a testament to Emily's impact on everyone she met. But the one thing that mattered most was the one thing John couldn't rush: time. The days turned into weeks as Emily remained in a coma. The hospital room, with its pale walls and soft beeping of machines, became John's second home. He arranged his work so he could be near her as much as possible, relying on his laptop and the hospital's Wi-Fi to keep up with his responsibilities. Nurses came and went, their faces becoming familiar, their smiles a small comfort in the relentless wait. John talked to Emily every day, updating her on the little details of life she was missing. He told her about the latest episodes of their favorite sci-fi series, described the changing leaves visible from the hospital window, and shared news of her friends who sent their love and asked about her constantly. Every now and then, he would play her favorite music, classical pieces she had practiced on her violin, hoping the familiar melodies would reach her, stir something in her mind. Family and friends visited often. Her Aunt Lisa brought homemade meals for John, knowing the hospital cafeteria food was wearing on him. Emily's best friend, Sarah, would sit by her bedside, chatting about school projects and gossip, laughing and crying in equal measure. They all hoped their voices, their presence, might bridge the gap between Emily and the waking world. The medical staff provided updates that were cautiously optimistic. They praised Emily's strong heart and young body, which were fighting hard to heal. But the brain is a complex organ, mysterious in its workings, and they couldn't make any promises. The uncertainty was agonizing, but John clung to hope, to every positive sign, no matter how small. At night, when the visitors left and the hospital quieted down, John's vigil continued. He often read aloud from a book they had started but never finished, his voice soft in the dimly lit room. He would talk to her about his day, about the silly mishaps at the office, or the new cafe he and Emily were supposed to visit together. He'd share his fears and hopes, pouring out his thoughts to her still form, finding some solace in the one-sided conversations. During those long nights, he sometimes observed the nurses on their rounds, noting their gentle efficiency as they checked on Emily and the other patients. One nurse in particular, Nurse Helen, showed a tender concern for Emily, often adjusting her blankets or gently brushing her hair. Her kindness was a balm to John's frayed nerves. As weeks turned into a month, the strain began to show on John. The initial rush of emergency had settled into a grueling routine of waiting, hoping, and dreading. Yet he never faltered in his belief that Emily would come back to him. He held on to the moments of connection, the squeeze of a hand, the flutter of an eyelid, even if the doctors cautioned him that these might be involuntary. John's life was suspended in that hospital room, caught between memories of Emily in motion, laughter ringing out as she danced around their living room, and the quiet reality of her, lying so still. He talked to her about the future, about all the places they would visit once she was well, about the graduation ceremony she would walk in, about the life she had yet to live. His voice, filled with love and longing, filled the room, never ceasing to believe that one day she might respond. One evening, as John sat beside Emily's bed, holding her hand like he always did, a new doctor walked into the room. He was tall, with neatly combed hair and sharp eyes that scanned the machines before settling on John. His name tag read Dr. Smith, and he introduced himself as the new lead on Emily's case. John had grown used to the routine of different nurses and doctors coming in, checking on Emily, making notes, and then moving on. But something about Dr. Smith's presence made him feel uneasy. His words were polite, his tone calm, yet there was something about his gaze that didn't feel as warm as the other doctors. Dr. Smith spoke in a reassuring voice. "We're trying a few new approaches to help with Emily's recovery. She's young, strong, and has a good chance of waking up. We just need to be patient." John nodded, his tired eyes filled with hope. He wanted to believe that the doctors were doing everything they could. But as Dr. Smith adjusted the IV and checked her vitals, something about the way he moved made John uneasy. It was almost as if he was too focused on the machines, too clinical, and less concerned with Emily as a person. Over the next few days, John noticed small changes. Emily's medication dosage was slightly altered. The nurses followed new instructions left by Dr. Smith. They were subtle shifts, nothing dramatic, but John had spent every waking hour in this room. He knew when something was different. When he asked Nurse Helen about it, she hesitated before answering. "Dr. Smith believes it's the best course of action," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "He has experience with cases like Emily's." John nodded but couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He trusted the hospital staff, but his instincts screamed at him to be more watchful. One night, long after visiting hours had ended, John woke up from a light nap in his chair to a soft noise. His heart pounded as he sat up, glancing at Emily. Everything seemed normal, but he had the strange feeling that someone had just been in the room. The hallway outside was dimly lit, empty except for a nurse walking at the far end. Trying to calm his racing thoughts, he told himself he was just exhausted, imagining things. But deep inside, a new worry was forming, one that he couldn't ignore. Dr. Smith was hiding something, and John was going to find out what it was. The hospital room was silent except for the steady beeping of the machines. The dim glow from the hallway light cast soft shadows across Emily's face. John sat beside her, his fingers gently wrapped around her hand, as he had done every day for the past several weeks. His exhaustion was deep, but his determination was stronger. That night, something changed. John had drifted into a light sleep when a sudden, sharp gasp startled him awake. His heart pounded as he turned to Emily. At first, he thought he was dreaming. But then, her fingers twitched. A faint movement, barely noticeable, but enough to send a jolt of hope through him. Emily. His voice cracked with emotion as he leaned closer, gripping her hand tighter. Then, before his eyes, her eyelids fluttered, her breathing changed, becoming slightly uneven. And then, with great effort, her eyes opened. For a moment, she stared at the ceiling, her gaze unfocused. John felt tears sting his eyes. Emily, you're awake. But instead of relief or confusion, a look of sheer terror spread across her face. Her eyes darted around the room wildly, and when they landed on John, she gasped, then screamed, "Dad, help me." Her voice was hoarse from weeks of silence, but the desperation in her tone was unmistakable. John was frozen in shock. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times. Her waking up, recognizing him, crying tears of joy. But this was different. This was fear. "What is it, sweetheart?" he asked gently, trying to calm her. "It's okay, you're safe. I'm here." But Emily clung to his hand, her grip weak yet urgent. Her chest rose and fell rapidly as she struggled to speak. "The doctor. He's lying," she choked out, her voice trembling. John's breath caught in his throat. "What? What do you mean?" Emily's body trembled as she tried to sit up, wincing at the effort. "I heard them," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "While I was asleep, I heard them talking." John's heart pounded. "Who? What did they say?" Before she could answer, the door to the room swung open. A nurse rushed in, alerted by the sound of Emily's scream. Her wide eyes flickered between Emily and John. "She's awake," she gasped, pressing the call button on the wall. "We need a doctor in here." John turned back to Emily, whose frightened gaze locked onto the nurse. Her lips parted as if she wanted to say something, but she hesitated. Then, gripping John's arm tightly, she whispered, "Don't trust him." Before John could process her words, footsteps echoed in the hallway. The approaching sound was steady, controlled. And then, standing at the doorway, was Dr. Smith. His usual calm smile remained in place, but John now saw it differently. It wasn't reassuring. It was cold. Emily's grip on John's hand tightened. Something was very, very wrong. Dr. Smith entered the room with his calm, controlled smile, but John could sense the tension in the air. Emily's grip on his hand was tighter now, her fear plain on her face. The nurse looked back and forth between them, unsure of what was going on, but stepped aside to let Dr. Smith through. "Ah, you're awake, Emily," Dr. Smith said, his voice smooth, almost rehearsed. "This is wonderful news." Emily pressed herself against the raised back of the bed. "Stay away from me," she said in a trembling voice. John immediately stood up, placing himself between Dr. Smith and his daughter. "She just woke up," John said firmly. "She's disoriented. Let's give her some space." Dr. Smith raised an eyebrow, but didn't move any closer. "Of course, I just need to check her vitals and make sure she's stable." "You don't need to do anything right now," John replied, his tone sharper than he intended. "She's been through enough." The room fell silent for a moment. Dr. Smith adjusted his glasses, his calm demeanor never wavering. "Mr. Brown," he began, "I understand this has been an incredibly difficult time for you, but my priority is Emily's recovery. Please allow me to do my job." John didn't back down. "Your job is to help my daughter, not scare her." Emily's gaze darted between the two men. She looked pale, her breathing quick and shallow. "Dad," she whispered, "he's not who he says he is." Dr. Smith tilted his head slightly. "Emily, you've been through a lot. It's common for patients who wake from a coma to feel confused or suspicious. I assure you, I'm here to help you." But Emily shook her head weakly. "I heard him," she insisted. "I heard him talking about experiments." John's stomach dropped. "What experiments?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Dr. Smith let out a small chuckle. "She's been in a coma for weeks, Mr. Brown. What she's describing is likely a dream or a memory from the medication we've used. It's not unusual." Emily's hand trembled as she reached for her father. It wasn't a dream. It was real. John turned back to Dr. Smith, his jaw tightening. "Until we sort this out, you're not touching her. I want a second opinion. Bring in another doctor." Dr. Smith's expression darkened for the first time. His voice lost its smoothness as he replied, "That won't be necessary. I've been overseeing her care since the beginning. And now I'm asking for someone else," John said, his voice rising. "You've lost our trust." The nurse glanced nervously between them, then stepped out into the hall, likely to call for help. Emily's grip on her father's hand didn't relax. She whispered again, "Don't let him near me." Dr. Smith stayed where he was, his smile gone. For the first time, John felt that this man wasn't just another doctor. He was something much more dangerous. 2 seconds. The room felt heavier after Dr. Smith left. He had retreated, claiming he'd respect their wishes and bring in a different doctor. But John could tell by his stiff walk and the sharp glance he shot over his shoulder that this wasn't over. Emily sat back on the bed, still pale and trembling. John took her hand again, trying to reassure her. "Emily," he said gently, "can you tell me exactly what you heard?" She hesitated, her wide eyes darting to the door, as if expecting Dr. Smith to come back at any moment. "It was while I was asleep," she said slowly. "I couldn't move or open my eyes, but I could hear them." "Them?" John asked, his brow furrowing. "Dr. Smith and someone else," Emily replied, her voice shaking. "They thought I couldn't hear them. I heard him say something about running tests. He wasn't talking about saving me. He was talking about studying me, like I wasn't even a person." John's heart sank. "Did you hear anything else?" Emily nodded. "He said I was a perfect candidate, that my condition made it easier to try something experimental. And then he laughed. It didn't sound like a doctor who wanted to help me." John felt a surge of anger rising in his chest. He didn't know what Dr. Smith's motives were, but if there was even a chance that his daughter had been treated as an experiment, he needed answers. "Don't worry, sweetheart," John said firmly. "We'll get to the bottom of this. I won't let anyone hurt you." Just then, the door opened again. It was Nurse Helen. She had a clipboard in hand and a cautious look on her face. "Mr. Brown," she said softly, "I've called another doctor. They're on their way. In the meantime, I'm here to help Emily if she needs anything." John gave a small nod. "Thank you, Helen. I appreciate it." Nurse Helen approached Emily's bedside and smiled kindly. "How are you feeling, Emily? Any pain?" Emily shook her head, but her eyes still held fear. Helen reached out and adjusted her pillow, speaking in a soothing tone. "It's okay to be scared. Waking up after all this time is a big deal, but you're safe now, and we're all here for you." John saw a slight relaxation in Emily's posture. Helen's calming presence seemed to help, at least a little. Still, the questions in John's mind wouldn't stop. What exactly had Dr. Smith been doing? Why would Emily say such a thing unless she truly believed it? And who else was involved? As the minutes ticked by, John's determination grew. He was going to find out what was happening at this hospital. He owed it to Emily. No matter what it took, he would protect his daughter. As promised, a different doctor arrived later that evening. His name was Dr. Patel, a soft-spoken man with a gentle smile. He introduced himself, took a seat at Emily's bedside, and spoke to her in a way that immediately put her at ease. He asked simple questions about how she was feeling, explained her condition in clear, kind terms, and reassured her that everything was going to be okay. For the first time since she woke up, Emily's breathing seemed to steady, and some of the fear in her eyes began to fade. John stayed quiet, listening carefully to every word. He didn't bring up Dr. Smith or Emily's earlier accusations just yet. First, he needed to establish trust with Dr. Patel. The last thing he wanted was for Emily to feel overwhelmed or dismissed again. When Dr. Patel stepped outside the room to speak privately with John, Emily clung to her father's arm. "Don't leave me," she whispered. "I'll be right outside," John promised. "Just a minute, okay?" Reluctantly, she let go, and John followed the doctor into the hallway. Once out of earshot, John immediately asked, "Dr. Patel, have you reviewed Emily's case? And I mean all of it. Her records, her treatment history, and what Dr. Smith's been doing." Dr. Patel nodded. "I've gone through everything," he said, his tone serious now. "And I can tell you that Emily is receiving the proper care. The medications she's been given, the treatments, none of it looks out of the ordinary." John frowned. Then why would she say the doctor was lying? Why would she wake up so scared? Dr. Patel hesitated. "It's not unusual for patients coming out of long comas to experience confusion. Sometimes they have vivid dreams or hallucinations that feel very real to them. It could be that Emily misheard something while she was in that state." John clenched his fists, frustration building. "You're telling me it's all in her head? That she imagined it?" "I'm not dismissing her feelings," Dr. Patel said quickly. "But there's no evidence that Dr. Smith, or anyone else, did anything inappropriate. If there were, I'd act on it immediately." John's shoulders slumped. "So what do I do? Just tell her it was a bad dream and move on?" "Not at all," Dr. Patel said gently. "Listen to her, reassure her that she's safe now. The important thing is that Emily knows she's heard and cared for. Over time, as she recovers, these fears may fade." It wasn't the answer John wanted, but he knew Dr. Patel was trying to help. As they walked back into the room, John took his daughter's hand, smiled, and told her softly, "We'll figure this out together." Emily looked at him with tired but trusting eyes, and in that moment, John knew that whatever it took, he would stay by her side, fighting for her and her peace of mind. In the days following the visit from Dr. Patel, Emily began to slowly regain her strength. She still had moments of fear, clutching her father's hand whenever a nurse or doctor entered the room. John did everything he could to reassure her. He brought her favorite music to play softly in the background, decorated the room with cheerful flowers, and even read her favorite stories aloud. Each small comfort helped rebuild her sense of safety. As Emily grew stronger, John continued to watch every interaction with the hospital staff carefully. Nurse Helen, always gentle and kind, became Emily's favorite, and the other nurses followed Dr. Patel's more transparent approach. They explained every procedure, every adjustment to her medication, and made sure she understood what was happening. This openness seemed to put Emily more at ease, though John could tell that her earlier fears still lingered in the back of her mind. One day, while Emily was sitting up in bed eating some soup, something she hadn't been able to do for weeks, John leaned closer. "Emily," he said softly, "I want you to tell me if you ever feel uncomfortable. If someone says or does something that doesn't feel right, you tell me immediately, okay?" She nodded, her eyes steady on him. "I promise." It wasn't just a promise, it was a bond. John had realized that the most important thing he could give her was the assurance that she wasn't alone. That no matter what happened, she had someone in her corner, ready to listen and take action. As more time passed, Emily started doing light physical therapy. She took slow, careful steps around the room, with John cheering her on. Each step forward was a small victory. Her laughter returned in bits and pieces. When Nurse Helen told a corny joke, Emily giggled. When John showed her funny photos on his phone, she smiled and rolled her eyes in that way only a teenager could. John began to see the spark in her eyes again, the spark that had been missing since the accident. While he never forgot the moment she first woke up, scared and shouting for help, he chose to focus on how far she had come since then. He didn't push her to relive what she'd heard or felt during her coma. Instead, he let her set the pace, opening up when she was ready. As the weeks turned into months, Emily left the hospital, leaning on John for support, but walking out on her own 2 feet. She still had a journey ahead of her, appointments, therapy sessions, and a long road to full recovery. But she was alive and smiling. The bond between father and daughter had grown even stronger, forged by the love and determination they shared. And as they stepped out into the sunlight, John felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time: hope.